Welcome to School Choice Report, where we explore everything about one of the most important education topics. I'm your host, David Hardy. In this podcast, we'll be talking to experts, educators, and parents to get a deep dive into the world of school choice. Whether you're an advocate, skeptic, or just curious, this podcast is for you. So sit back, relax, and let's get started with the conversation. Today, we're here to talk about school choice in Pennsylvania and across the country. The purpose of this show is to provide an education on the public educational system. It used to be thought you could just send your child to school and they would take care of them. They'd handle everything. Well, I'm not sure that ever was the case, but we know from the pandemic that that is absolutely not the case. There are lots of places where public options really aren't feasible. If you're in a low-income neighborhood, normally the public option is not a good option. Same thing if you're in a rural community, or if your child has some type of special needs or is seeking some type of special curriculum. The public option just doesn't fit most of the time. And there have been efforts to expand educational options, charter schools, cyber schools, we've got vouchers, homeschooling, and now even pods. Most of the innovations are promising, and we see better results in a lot of them. But what we don't see in most of them is that whole flatlining that you see too often in government-run schools. So I guess the question is, what is school choice? School choice is the ability to pick the right educational setting for your child. School choice is something that the wealthy have had since the beginning of time. They've been able to send their child to the place where they wanted them to be educated. Or they could move to the school district that they felt was a high-performing school district. Or if they didn't think their school district was high-performing, but they still wanted their child to be there, they could afford supplemental educational support for their child to be able to give them a better educational experience. But for the poor, they were stuck with one option, a government option, and a lot of times a government option that really wasn't good for them. It wasn't good for their parents, and sometimes even wasn't good for their grandparents. That's what we have to change. One of the things that has been a little disappointing is that any effort to expand school choice has been met with organized, well-funded opposition. And it comes from two places. It comes from school districts, and it comes from teachers' unions. So the purpose of this podcast is to give you information about school choice, like I said, both locally, statewide, and nationally, legislative initiatives that are going on, local government initiatives, and national efforts. Ways to give children more options. Our goal is to bring the school choice conversation to the forefront, show the benefits of a pluralistic public education system that most industrialized countries have. We're going to bring on our guest today, and our guest is a very knowledgeable person about public education in Pennsylvania, not just the academic outcomes, but also the whole financial setup of public education. That's my good friend, Mr. Nathan Benefield, Vice President of the Commonwealth Foundation. How you doing, Nate?
I'm doing well, David.
So, Nate, you've been around the block with this thing. First of all, I want to ask you, what do you think Pennsylvania sits in the whole school choice effort? You've got places like Arizona and Florida, which are gone full board with school choice. Where's Pennsylvania sit on that?
Yeah, Pennsylvania, it's, and I usually I'm going to talk a lot of Pennsylvania issues. Most of the time I'm talking about how Pennsylvania is near the bottom of the country in terms of job growth, economic growth, a lot of things. In terms of school choice, we're actually fairly high in terms of the number of students and parents who are exercising choice in actual programs. But still, like those top states, Arizona, Florida, West Virginia, Arizona got universal school choice. I know Iowa and Utah have just passed similar things. That is far and away ahead of where Pennsylvania is. And so while we're better than most states that have really limited choices and for parents, we're still a long way from that, from those top. And I kind of just point this out in terms of, where people choose their school. As you mentioned, the number one school choice program is school choice by mortgage, that parents can exercise on where they're going to move and send their kids. But currently about 70% of Pennsylvania students attend a district school. Now, those could include magnet schools or specialty schools, not necessarily the neighborhood school, but about 70% in the district, 8% in charter schools. I know Pennsylvania is higher than a lot of states in terms of number of students attending charter schools. Then about 12% attend private schools. And that's a fairly high number of exercising that. A lot of them through our tax credit scholarship programs. Pennsylvania has a program where businesses can donate to scholarship organizations to provide scholarships for private school choice. And those are among the larger programs in the country, and I think that helps have us have a robust sector for those students. But it is still far away from where states like Arizona and Florida have jumped ahead with education savings accounts.
People always talk about educational funding in Pennsylvania. We don't fund our schools enough. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I know that people play with numbers, and this is a case where that happens. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, our state is one of the highest spending in terms of per student funding, nearly $20,000 per student. It's about $4,000 more than the national average in what public school district spending is. And one of the myths, there are two myths. One, just a general underfunding, or it's not the fair share. And they ask, like, what does that mean? What's full funding mean? And it always just means more. No matter what the number is,
right.
It means more. And they can go state to state. So you need to spend more. You need to spend more here, without actually giving here's what it takes to educate the child. One of the myths is that Pennsylvania, the percentage that comes from state government is lower than in other states, and we have higher local costs. The reality is Pennsylvania doesn't have many caps on school property taxes. So some schools are spending a lot more because they've been able to raise property taxes. But the reality is our state funding is actually higher than the national average. And the way that, if you put it in math, like, would you rather have 38% of $20,000 or 45% of $15,000? And if you do the math, well, 38% of 20,000 is more, but they use that number of 38% saying, hey, Pennsylvania doesn't give enough, doesn't spend enough on public schools. The reality is we spend a lot more than the national average, and are number 8 in terms of total spending per student in the country.
That's pretty impressive. So why do they keep saying they need more money?
Well, that's their job. Obviously, if you run a public school, you want more money, and it is who's to blame? And this is a question that kind of ties to performance. So you talk about some of the numbers when you say, hey, test scores declined. If you're a school administrator, what do you say is the problem? Well, it's not enough funding. And this is something that is the constant thing. There is a entire lobbying sector. I think you alluded to it, that school boards, there's a school boards administration paid by the school districts, paid with taxpayer money, that lobbies for more money. There is a teachers union who lobbies for more money, and also lobbies against funding for alternatives, against charter schools, against tax credit scholarships, against education savings accounts that allow parents to choose where to send their school. There's a huge lobbying operation funded by these public schools. And in many ways, not only the total dollar amount, but the way we fund public schools is driven by the adults employed in the system more so than it is by parents and students.
One of the things that I was recently at a conference and saw a presentation, and they talked about redlining. And they talked about how when President Roosevelt wanted to encourage home ownership and he created the FHA, that there were limits as to where they could lend. And they had what they called undesirable neighborhoods. They were normally minority neighborhoods. Well, at some point, everybody realized that was illegal. So those laws are out the window. You can't do that anymore. But they never changed those rules for public schools. They used the same type of setup, and they haven't changed that at all. And for all that asking for money and talking about all the things that they need to do, you never hear them talk about changing the whole school assignment by address system. Why they hold on to that? I mean, that seems like that would be low-hanging fruit.
It is and it isn't. It's one of those things that, kind of no one talks about, that, there are barriers to choosing your school. One of them is the district lines, that it is illegal to send your kid to a school, and I know a lot of parents, and I think you've experienced this, and lie about their address to get their kid into a different school. I know people have gone to jail for trying to send their kid to a different public school because of the just crossing the lines. And that is a system, and I think it applies to the opposition, whether you're talking about having choice across district boundaries or even some of the school choice programs. And we've noted a number of politicians who send their kids to private school but don't want, a system to allow poor kids to go to those same schools. It's kind of this opposition, like we don't want those kids in our school. And that is a lot of the opposition and why we have the system of zip code assigned schools.
Well, you and I have been privy to some polling that was done recently. And one thing that I thought was interesting was that people without a bachelor's degree were more amiable to school choice and letting people have options than highly educated people. We know that the highly educated people are the ones who have the choice by mortgage and also heavily use private schools. That's some serious hypocrisy there.
Yeah. And it's either hypocrisy or it is simply a case of, hey, we were better off. We chose the school, and we don't want to have lower income families have that same option with the scholarship or with being able to just migrate across district lines. And that is unfortunate, the predicament I think our state and our country is in of, getting opposition. And a lot of the opposition, there's support for school choice among voters across the board. But among politicians, you see, rural Republicans supporting school choice, urban areas, Democrats supporting school choice. That's where a lot of the constituents are. And a lot of it is kind of the suburban liberals who are the strongest opposition, suburban progressives. And it is somewhat of that, mantra of, everything should be done by the public school, the government schools, that's the way to go. Some of it is simply we want to keep what we have, but prevent you from getting a share of that. And I think that's something that's unspoken in this movement.
Well, you're familiar with Ashley Berner's work, and one of the things she talks about are the myths, why people think that you should have government-run public schools. Because if you look around the country, most industrialized countries don't have a single government-run monopoly for schooling. They pay for other types of schooling. And she said that one of the myths was that you teach citizenship in public schools. And, I always thought citizenship was getting along with each other. It's not happening. It's not happening. So the other thing was that government schools could guarantee like equal opportunity for everybody. And we know that's not happening. The final thing was that the whole separation of church and state is something that's constitutional. You would be going against the Constitution to do this. And I start naming, the foods. We don't have government supplied food anymore. You have a cash card and you can go shop anywhere you want. You go to Wegmans with that card. The same thing with healthcare and the same thing with social services. There's a lot of religious organizations that provide social services paid for by the government. But the one place that doesn't happen is schools. How did they get so strong that they can do what nobody else has been able to get away with?
I mean, it's been a long trend of I guess, building up this mindset and this kind of monopoly, semi-monopoly they have, and trying to keep the status quo. Because as you mentioned, some of these arguments don't hold weight. I think the constitutionalities, the courts have held up. Like if you're giving money to families, to parents, that is absolutely constitutional. They can use that for any type of school, whether they teach religion or not. And so some of these excuses don't make sense when you consider it. And talking to a lawmaker the other day, and he made the argument of, when, a student graduates college at age 18, we give them, scholarships. They can go to any school they want anywhere in the country. If you want a public school, a private school, you want to go to a community college, pick the best school that's for you. But 6 months earlier, when they're in high school, if they want to leave their neighborhood, it's like, oh, outrageous. How dare they take, public money to go to a private school? That doesn't make any sense why we have this, very much voucher choice model in higher ed, but we don't have it for K through 12. It's just hypocrisy.
The other thing, and this I guess, when did Romney run? It's 2012. 2012, Senator Romney came to Philadelphia and he had meeting with a bunch of educators. I was there with them. And he was talking about school choice and having people be able to leave the neighborhood to go to a good school. And I pushed back on him a little bit and said that, if you had the resources in the neighborhood and you had the right people, you could have good schools in every neighborhood. I don't think most people want to travel a long way to go to school. That's why people move to a place where there's good schools. And if you had the resources, if you made the resources available, you might be able to have good private schools. In fact, there are good private schools in low-income neighborhoods. I just found a couple that I didn't know about in Philadelphia the other day. And I think that things like voucher programs could make more of those things available.
And that's, I think, part of the story that we want to tell at Commonwealth Foundation is about, some of these schools that they do succeed, serving, they're in the communities, in low-income areas, serving low-income populations, usually with far fewer resources, but getting, seeing the success stories of how those kids, overcome the demographics that normally say, well, low-income kids in poor communities aren't going to succeed. That's what a lot of public schools say. Well, those are the excuses why we have poor test scores because of the kids and the families. Those success stories of private schools overcoming that, their kids are going on to college. Kids are graduating and getting, doing very, very well in later in life. Telling those stories, and the reality is they are doing it with less. And you look at that, $20,000 we spend in public school. A lot of these private schools are, their overall cost is $6,000 to $8,000 or so, and our tax credit scholarships are only like $2,000. That's what we're providing to give these kids that opportunity. Charter schools certainly get less per student than the traditional public schools. So a lot of these schools that are doing very well are doing it with less resources. That's why we think, if the money followed the child in a true system, like what Arizona has, universal school choice, they get $7,000 per kid to, each kid gets $7,000 to go wherever they want. That kind of model would open up a lot more, I think, of those schools in low-income areas that are really committed to serving those kids with excellence in education.
Our new governor, when he was campaigning, was implying that he would be for the Lifeline Scholarship. And that was an interesting exercise for me, seeing the Lifeline Scholarship when I watched the entire Democratic Party get shut down to being able to speak about it. I mean, there was no debate. I wish somebody had said, I hate the Lifeline Scholarship, and made that argument. But when there's no debate at all, that's really not democracy. And that was a little fright. You were there. You tell me what you thought.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting, a couple of things. I think we've seen over a few decades of the issue becoming more partisan because there had been a lot of Democratic support for school choice. And then the unions basically made that the litmus test, and no Democrat would ever get any support from the unions if they supported school choice. And so you saw people like Cory Booker, Liz Warren, who had advocated for school choice going back and
vouchers.
Yeah,
she advocated for vouchers.
Yes, and then then Josh Shapiro, in running for governor, came out as one of the few leading Democrats who supported, said, "I'm supportive of this Lifeline Scholarship idea and for school choice." And it's interesting to me because he didn't necessarily need to. He was winning by a fairly large margin. He wasn't actually in a debate, setting per se, and never had a debate. He just came out and said he supports it. Obviously, wait to see what actually gets done in his administration. But I think he's seeing what's happening nationally, public support for this, and realizing that's where he needs to go because that's where the voters are.
Well, you recall in the last presidential primary, Liz Warren got caught not being honest about her school choice situation. Her son went to a private school. She said all her kids went to public school. To me, that was an unforced error. If she said my son went to the most expensive private school in the world, everybody would have said, good for you and your son. There's no criticism about where you send your child to school. It's about what you say about other people's children. And I think that's what Josh Shapiro kind of figured out and wanted to avoid that kind of thing. And he went to private school. His children went to private school. And nobody's going to, if anybody criticized him for that, I would defend him because I think that's his right. But the whole idea of us spending upwards of $20,000 to send somebody to a school that they know they don't want to go to, that their parents didn't want to go to and failed in. And like I said, sometimes even their grandparents, to make that person do that, that's cruel. Just cruel.
Yeah, and that's, really what, a lot of the opposition saying we should stop families from choosing, having the option to go to a charter school, having the option to get a scholarship to go to a private school, is basically, like putting up the Berlin Wall to stop kids from leaving. And we shouldn't, that to me is just an immoral thing. Why would you stop parents from leaving a school that they believe is failing or isn't safe for their kids to find a better option? It really is, as much as it is this is good policy, it has, good outcomes, it's a moral thing.
Yeah. Well, Nate, thank you for being here with us today. I'm sure I'm going to have you back because we got to talk about money, which is the root of all school arguments. I want to have you back as soon as we can. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, David.
That's it for today's episode of School Choice Report. I hope you found the conversation enlightening and informative. If you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us at schoolchoicereport.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our show wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. Until next time, this is David Hardy signing off. Thanks for tuning in.